Hi, everyone. Today we're looking at week 30 from our one-year New Testament Bible reading plan. We're looking at the final chapters of the Gospel of Luke. So we're looking at chapters 19 through 24. Now, please note that chapter 24 actually appears in our week 31 readings, but for continuity's sake, we'll just wrap up the Gospel of Luke in this video. And then in our next video, we'll start 1 Corinthians and just look at the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians. Luke 19 begins with the encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus, the tax collector. So, of course, when Jesus travels from place to place, he attracts a crowd, and of course, there are tons of people around him, but so many want to see him and encounter him. And Zacchaeus, of course, has the misfortune of being very short, so he can't get through the crowd. He can't see over the crowd. So what does he do? He climbs a tree. What's remarkable is Jesus calls him out. Jesus doesn't just ignore him. And what's doubly remarkable about that is that Zacchaeus is not just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector. So he's in charge of all the tax collectors in the area. He's probably the most hated person in his part of the Jewish world. And anybody who is a devout Jew would think of Zacchaeus as the very last person Jesus would want to have anything to do with. And yet Jesus stops in his tracks, sees Zacchaeus in the tree, and says, "Have me over to your place for dinner." And so Jesus comes to Zacchaeus' house. The people marvel that Jesus has gone to the home of a sinner. And we see this remarkable thing. Zacchaeus is just caught up by Jesus, and his heart is instantly changed by this encounter, by Jesus' acceptance of him. Now, Zacchaeus is a pretty important illustration for us because he's a counterexample to some of the passages in the Gospels where Jesus seems to be particularly hard on the wealthy. You know, the rich young ruler comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Look, to be saved, you have to leave your wealth behind." And so we think, well, that must be the rule. Of course, that in itself is not a hard and fast rule, because here we have Zacchaeus, and he's perfectly willing to change his relationship with money. He's willing to pay back anybody that he's cheated, and henceforth he's willing to give away half his possessions to the poor. He doesn't give it all away, but what he does commit to is evidence enough that Jesus has replaced wealth in Zacchaeus' heart as Zacchaeus' highest priority. So Zacchaeus is a good illustration, first, that you can be wealthy and be a committed follower of Jesus, and how to have a relationship with Jesus and have a relationship with wealth. Jesus then gives the parable of the 10 minas, which is a variation on the parable of the talents, where there's a ruler. He leaves his servants in charge of his estate, entrusts them to varying degrees of resources, and then comes back and holds them accountable for how they've invested his resources. Now, the lesson in this parable for us is not, well, you're going to be in trouble if you don't invest your resources just right. There are 2 takeaways. First, the recognition that everything that we have in this life is a sacred trust from our master. It's not our stuff, it's his stuff, and he has specifically given it to us for the sake of investing in his kingdom. So that's the first thing. We are simply stewards of all that God has entrusted to us. But the second is actually, paradoxically, to invest the resources of the kingdom fearlessly and confidently. The actual sin of the servant that does wrong with the resources is that he is self-protective, and he perceives his master to be harsh and judgmental instead of generous and gracious. And so there too, we're actually invited to invest the Lord's resources freely and courageously, rather than fearfully and self-protectively. Now we have the the episode of the triumphal entry. And so we've entered Holy Week. The last third of the Gospel of Luke is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life leading up to the cross. Jesus rides into Jerusalem. He's heralded as the Messiah. The Pharisees in the crowd tell Jesus to rebuke the disciples for claiming him as Messiah, and Jesus says, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. So Jesus says, look, I am who they say I am, and all creation will recognize it, even if they don't. But then he weeps over Jerusalem. It's this kind of very poignant scene where he says, how I have longed to cradle you and protect you, and instead you'll be destroyed. So he's weeping over the impending destruction of the city coming in AD 70. So clearly Jesus comes in as the King of the Jews and as the true King who genuinely has the Jewish people in his heart in love. Jesus goes to the temple, he clears it out, and specifically what he takes exception to is that God's house has become a place of commerce. And here too, this is I would say, a caution to all of us to not infuse our faith and our worship with commercial and political ventures and ambitions. In Luke 20, of course, now Jesus has entered Jerusalem, so for the week leading up to his crucifixion, he and his disciples are in Jerusalem. They're interacting with the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And so there's this confrontation where the Pharisees and teachers of the law ask him where he got his authority, and he poses them a question in response that puts them on the spot. And again, Jesus just demonstrates his authority and his mastery over any adversary. We get the parable of the talents, which is again a variation on the same theme that we talked about in the 10 minas. Jesus is confronted again by the Pharisees and teachers of the law, specifically this time on the question of taxes. And they say, well, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And again, they're testing Jesus' popularity because even those who are most passionately committed to Jesus really don't like the Romans and have misgivings about paying taxes to the Romans. Jesus asks for a coin that's stamped with the emperor's image. He says, whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. What Jesus is really saying is, look, just let the currency of this world go back to whom it belongs, but bear in mind that you yourself are currency stamped with the image of an emperor, the emperor being the true one, God himself. Don't get so hung up about where your money goes. Be preoccupied with where your heart goes. Jesus is confronted by the Sadducees, who believe there's no resurrection, and so they challenge Jesus about marriage and the resurrection. And Jesus says, look, you're misunderstanding how the resurrection will work. At the resurrection, at the renewal of all things, relationships won't work the way they do now. There won't be marriage and giving in marriage. But he confirms that, in fact, there will be a resurrection. Jesus then poses to them this question based on one of the Psalms, and specifically is talking about his own lordship and divinity, where he says, David was speaking prophetically about me. He wasn't talking about his biological descendant or son. He was talking about a greater king, whom David addresses as Lord. He says, that's who I am. Jesus turns to his disciples, warns them against the teachers of the law again, and points out their hypocrisy. In Luke 21, we have the episode of Jesus observing people giving their offerings, and he observes a poor widow giving everything she has, and identifies again this theme that we saw initially in the interaction with the rich young ruler, where Jesus says it's not about the contents of your wallet, it's the contents of your heart. How much of your very self are you offering to God? And this is his question to us. Jesus and his disciples visit the temple. The disciples, who are, small town guys from out in the country, they marvel at the size of the temple. And by all accounts, it was an extraordinary structure. The stones that they remark upon, some of them were as large as city buses. And Jesus says very casually, not one of these stones will be left on another. And then the disciples, assuming that will come at the end of time, say, well, when is that going to happen? And Jesus gives a sequence of statements that refer both to the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, but then some broader teaching about the end of time. And because he is answering two questions simultaneously, when will the temple be destroyed and when will history come to an end, it's hard for us to tease out which statement applies to which event. In Luke 22, we have Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. This is a necessary event that will eventually lead to Jesus' sacrificial death, an inevitable part of God's plan of redemption for the whole human race. The Last Supper comes, and Jesus sits down with his disciples. Jesus has the pointed conversation with Peter, in which Jesus says, Peter, you will betray me. He warns his disciples that a time is coming when they will have to be prepared to be scattered and go out into the world. And they wrap up their dinner. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, prays. His disciples fall asleep, and he asks them why they can't persist. This is just a kind of a moving moment in which Jesus is profoundly alone. And of course, it anticipates his true aloneness at the cross. Jesus is arrested. The disciples flee. Peter denies Jesus his 3 times. And then Jesus is beaten and tortured. We have the trial before Pilate, which is pretty straightforward. But of course, again, there's this kind of troubling dynamic whereby the Jewish leadership, even though they have their Messiah in hand, betray him, choosing instead the Roman authority structure that they themselves have cursed. And it's a sad illustration of the compromises that people make when they want God to give them something in earthly terms, when they have some earthly agenda. They're willing to appeal to an earthly force, and at times they do that by sacrificing, turning away from God himself. Jesus is crucified. We have the interaction between Jesus and the thief on the cross, where the thief repents and Jesus says, truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. We need to bear in mind that this is a theme throughout Luke, where he constantly has the least likely people, outsiders, Gentiles, sinners, coming to Jesus and finding redemption, even up to the moment of Jesus' crucifixion. And anyone can place themselves in the position of the thief on the cross and recognize that there's always that possibility, that option of repenting and entering paradise. Jesus gives over his spirit. He dies. He's buried and grieved. And then, of course, we have the amazing account of the resurrection. The women come to the tomb. They encounter angels. They're told he is risen just as he told you. And then they encounter him. We have this great episode of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. This appears only in the Gospel of Luke. And there are a couple of interesting sides of it. Of course, one of them is identified by name, and this Cleopas appears elsewhere in the New Testament. He's referred to in letters, and I believe in Acts. But these 2 disciples kind of are a stand-in for all the disciples. They're grieving Jesus' death. They're walking away from Jerusalem. They're trying to make sense both of Jesus' death and burial, but also these strange reports that Jesus has risen and a stranger joins them. And they don't recognize him right away. And it's important for us to note again and again, this is true in every account of the initial encounters with Jesus, which speaks to the fact that post-resurrection, Jesus has a body that is of a different quality than the one that went into the grave. And for more information, for more teaching about the resurrection body, you can look at 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul goes into a fair amount of detail about the fact that the bodies that we will be raised in are of a different quality, will be of a different quality than these bodies that we're living in now. We don't know much more about that, but certainly, again, that's affirmed in all of these moments where the risen Lord Jesus encounters his disciples and they don't recognize him right away. They don't recognize him until he reveals himself to them. And this is what we see. Jesus accompanies the two to Emmaus. They sit down. And he says, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And then we're told, beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. In other words, Jesus goes back through the entire Hebrew scriptures, the whole Old Testament, and shows that the whole thing points to him. Good reminder for us that according to Jesus, the entire Old Testament points to him. They sit down at the table, he breaks bread, and that's when they recognize him. And then he disappears. He returns to the other disciples, and that's what we see next. Jesus appears to the other disciples, reassures them of his resurrection and his victory over death, reminds them both of what he told them would happen, as well as reminds them what is taught in Scripture. Jesus spends a fair amount of time with the disciples, and then at the very end of Luke's gospel, we get the account of Jesus' ascension to heaven. And of course, in the ascension, we see two things. The first is that the resurrection body of Jesus is a body that is perfectly at home both on earth, this material realm, as well as in heaven, the realm of the Spirit. So again, it's kind of a glimpse of a preview of the resurrection bodies that we will have, which are perfectly at home in the new heaven and the new earth, both places. But also that Jesus bodily transitions from earth to heaven, where we attest he is at the right hand of God the Father, interceding on our behalf. As the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 4, we have a perfect high priest who is in heaven now. Therefore, let us, with confidence, approach God's throne of grace. So that's the end of the Gospel of Luke. That's it for our week 30 readings. As always, keep studying and keep the faith.